Hey there, and thank you for letting Bandwidth Coast to Coast invade your ears for the next 60 minutes. There's a speech I reference in this interview whose message is the importance of the obvious, ordinary, take-it-for-granted things. It's in those obvious banalities that a lot gets away with being hidden directly in plain sight, or simply forgotten all about. How many issues have accepted silence and little political will been left to turn into bigger and bigger conundrums? I would submit that our current situation of rationalizing away debate in the name of unity is leaving more issues to fester. Issues like the war on terror, healthcare, voting rights, and have we really even built a healthy economy post the Great Recession, let alone COVID? Where have we gotten a good win in? Why is it that this is the accepted state of affairs? Before knowing why and where to go, it's useful to know what first. What is wrong with our current status quo? I follow the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, quite closely. I follow when she brokered to be voted back in as Speaker in 2018, and I also took notice when a Democrat, Shahid Buttar, was set to face her in the general election. I followed Shahid's campaign from afar, read his policy stances, comments on the political news of the moment, but it wasn't until preparing for this interview that I dove into Shahid the person. The musician, poet, activist, and lawyer. Shahid's been working on calling attention to and fighting the ever-increasing set of conundrums we face for years. When going through my research, I came across some writing Shahid's been doing since going back to Obama's early years. Reading Shahid's critique on the war on terror, encryption, his message to law students, then through his poetry, I found that the more I read, the more I found myself cheering along. In order to improve the status quo, I think we need multidimensional individuals who are willing to arise to the occasion. I got a glimpse of what Shahid knows, what he knows not just about the facade that is our government in bad need of reform, but where to find the cracks, how they've grown over the years, how deep it all goes. We talked across a range of topics, but they all kept on this unintended theme. Corporations have gained increasing influence on everything from what food is grown to what laws are written, and policymakers have been complicit in that, as well as many other direct violations of our rights as citizens. I really enjoy talking to him. Real quick before the episode starts, if you'd like to find us on your social media platform of choice, sign up for our mailing list to be the first to know about episode drops, know about upcoming guests or opportunities to ask questions and provide suggestions, please visit us at bandwidthpodcast.com. And of course, if you like what you hear, please follow, comment, or subscribe to the pod, however it is that this is getting to your ears. Without further delay, other than the sound of the ocean, Shahid Buttar, Congressional Candidate for California's 12th District. Thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate the time.
It's my pleasure, John. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you said that you're a little more chill after your run, so hopefully that passes off onto me because I'm extremely excited to talk to you. I was really excited when your campaign got back to me, and then I've been reading a bunch of your work going back a while, actually, in preparation for this, and it just got me more excited. So
right on.
Just so we have it, would you mind just introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name's Shahid Buttar. I'm a congressional candidate in San Francisco. I'm the first Democrat in 30 years to face House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in the general election that's underway now until November 3rd. I'm a civil liberties lawyer and an artist, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity of representing my city in Washington.
Awesome. I'm giving you lots of claps over here. So I've been doing this as like an opening question to my guests lately. And I'm going to give it to you. So what do you do that makes you happy?
Playing music or playing capoeira. I think I'm going to butcher this word, kinesthephile. I'm a lover of motion. So dance, martial arts, both hit my buttons. Like when I'm running, I'm usually actually just like training martial arts in the park, and getting in my body is a source of great relief for me. I grew up as a bookworm. And between being a bookworm and an immigrant, I had a tough time fitting in when I was younger. And it was musical theater in high school and then later martial arts in my 20s that really helped me just get in my body.
Yeah, I can resonate with that actually. Like I've been playing music for a long time, and it's definitely a very big happy place of mine.
Right
And
on.
it's like I actually can think of the markers in my life through music and like where I was at with like my practice.
Totally.
Um,
I can
and
totally relate to that. What kind of music do you play?
I play all over the place, but like blues and jazz is like my roots. And
Nice.
now this year, I dedicate every year to a new skill I'm learning. And this
Okay.
year, I'm learning Ableton.
Yeah, right
So,
on. So am I.
oh no shit.
I mean, it's like a lifelong practice. You know, I've been learning Ableton for too damn long, but yeah.
Yeah, I know. I'm
Um,
right there with you, and I'm like now in the thick of it. So
uh-huh, uh-huh.
I've been getting more into like electronic music. I got an MPK set up right next to me too. So
Right
I'm playing
on.
with that. Yeah.
Nice. Well, it's funny when you ask me what I do like for fun in the middle of the night, usually, like if I'm awake after 2 a.m., it's Ableton that I'm fiddling with, you know, like,
Right.
yeah, messing with beats and EQing tracks and finding samples. And yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what I do now. That's now
Mhm.
my late night. You know, my wife and dog are asleep, and I have a couple hours to kill. I'm just gonna go. I'm just gonna just play around.
Can totally relate to that. That frankly was kind of my dream. You know, if I had my druthers, I would be an artist for most of my time and I would speak out a lot about politics. And, you know, the fact that I'm a congressional candidate and I dabble in art on the side is sort of like an inversion of my preferences. You know, like I feel compelled by the circumstances
Right.
to run for office. I would much rather be living my life.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that. Yeah, and that's. I mean, I think there's a Plato quote that's it's totally eluding me right now, the direct phrasing of it, but essentially like the punishment for not getting involved in politics is that you end up getting governed by your lessers or your inferiors.
Mm-hmm.
And I think right now is quite a call to arms. And I think that kind of ethos is kind of reflected in just talking to you this short bit, because I mean, martial arts, like I love martial arts.
One of the things about capoeira I particularly like is it's kind of acrobatic, and I just wasn't lithe growing up. You know, the idea of like cartwheels and flips and stuff like that always seemed kind of fantastical to me. And so to be able to do things with my body that in the past I would have wanted to do, but wouldn't know the first way of how, you know, I just feel very fortunate and lucky. And one sort of like, sort of segue there, I mean, a tangent that maybe could be a segue. In 2009, I'd been training capoeira at that point just for a couple of, I think maybe a year. And I, at one point, was working for a San Francisco-based nonprofit when I first started training. And it was a startup nonprofit. We were all promised health insurance, but it didn't have its administration together. So I ended up, I left that organization to lead another nonprofit called the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. So I just gotten health insurance when I tore my Achilles tendon. And, you know, it's a $15,000 surgery. I couldn't walk for 6 months. If I didn't have health insurance, or if I gotten injured 6 months before, I would be walking with a limp for the rest of my life, or I'd be homeless. You know, one or the other. I mean, I don't, you know, you choose between healthcare and rent if you don't have the money, right? And I often think back on that moment for me as a point at which my commitment to universal healthcare, I mean, I was always a fan of single payer and favored it, but that was the point where I really realized, you know, but for the grace of whatever one might hold holy go I. And it was, yeah, a wake up call. And I know that entirely too many people don't have the insurance. And if they had a similar injury, you know, they're never going to jump or do cartwheels. And I'm so grateful every time I have the chance to dance or run or play capoeira, just to be able to do it, because for 6 months I couldn't even walk, you know, and it's not lost on me.
Yeah, that's lived experience is huge. And I think a lot of people take for granted having that chain of careers that have given them like that employer sponsored. And something that so like a lot of my friends or like my friends' siblings and things like that, a lot of what I hear now is that they can't afford their deductibles.
Right.
And some of these deductibles I'm hearing are like $7,000. And I'm like, whoa, like
Right.
how, like I don't know how much you make, but I have an idea of how much you make. And how could you afford that? Like that is outrageous.
Well, and why, like, if you're paying deductibles that's high, what's the point of having a premium in the first place?
Right.
Right. I mean, it does boggle the mind sometimes that you're paying money for the privilege to pay more money for a set of things that anybody anywhere else in the world gets for free.
Right.
And yet we have the audacity or the ignorance, choose your word, here in the United States to brag about being, you know, the leader of the free world. It's a stretch to say we're even in it at all.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that we are proud of our rights and our freedoms when we don't even have the same rights as people in these countries that our, you know, president denigrates, for instance. I think is just a profound irony.
Yeah, rights when it comes to healthcare, at least, definitely. That's a great point. And at
Or
that
more
point,
than that,
like
just the right to get home without getting shot by a cop. I mean, there's
that's
any number of rights we don't have that other people do.
yeah, I would agree with that. But at least just to stick on the healthcare thing for one more moment,
Yeah,
at that point, if you have like a $7,000 deductible or something at that point, really what you are doing is you're paying into insurance to not get taxed for not having insurance, right? And at that point, I would go again to saying that our current scheme of Obamacare, and obviously like there's a tax to it, and there shouldn't be, like, to certain things such as like the right to have health insurance and things like that. But
mm-hmm.
once again, all that really was monopolizing insurance companies, right?
Yes, huge point that you're making there, and it begs underscoring. The Affordable Care Act was written by a right-wing think tank, and it was modeled on a proposal implemented in Massachusetts by a Republican governor, and it was adopted by a Democratic president with the support of a Democratic Congress. And it is much more a massive structural subsidy for the health insurance industry, the private corporate health insurance industry, than it is a lever to expand care. It's not universal health care. It did not include a public option. It absolutely put the profits of health insurance companies before the needs of patients. And it's one reason why premiums go up every year, as do deductibles. And the idea that you're paying more for a service that is less and less comprehensive, and that's been the trajectory every year since the law was established, is just simple proof that the companies don't have the public interests at heart, and that this law, frankly, how do I put this? A lot of conservatives will declare their allegiance to the market, and they will couch their, whether it's greed or attitude favoring wealth accumulation, in these terms of favoring a market. But the ACA isn't even that. It leans on the scale of a market to skew it in favor of insurance companies against the voting public. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so dedicated to Medicare for All, is that we absolutely need to have a system where cost is not a barrier. As long as cost is a barrier to care, especially in the middle of a contagious, virulent pandemic, we are just ducking into the punch of it. We are allowing unnecessary threat vectors to public health to be created. And it's just a tool of public policy. That is a policy choice that is literally driving Americans into our graves.
Yeah, and I think some of the points there that I would like to kind of go with too is, a pandemic has shown that public health is a national security issue, right? And
Absolutely.
And I would even say that it's not even a stretch that some of the civil disobedience and just overall tenuous nature that we are feeling right now, and having it to the point of it is because of the economic fallout from said pandemic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which
No
all
question.
of that, once again, to the ACA, through the economic disparities, I would say that COVID is just advancing trajectories we were already on.
All true things. Yeah, we've had longstanding inequities in care, and the pandemic has magnified them. At the same time, I mean, not to be too glib about it, under the preceding era, even with the longstanding inequities, plenty of people enjoyed a privilege that they have since lost. Like COVID isn't just striking people that were at risk before. Wealthy people are passing away too. Herman Cain comes to mind. It doesn't discriminate. It does, the access to care is discriminated. Again, that's the policy choice. But I just want to push back on the insinuate or the potential idea that people of privilege can escape the pandemic, like inevitably, because it's contagious and because it's virulent. If anybody has it, the rest of us are at risk. It's exactly why we all have an interest. We all share an interest in making sure that everybody can get the care and the medicine that they need. I often describe this commitment to for-profit corporate healthcare as predatory, and in the time before the pandemic as a vicious policy or a brutal policy. When I feel the need to try to help people laugh, because I often share very grim news, I'll remind people that it's a policy that one might think of as barbaric, except that that's unfair to Northern European Germanic tribes that did in fact treat themselves better than we do in the United States. So it's not even barbaric. But today, during a pandemic, it's just idiotic. It's not just brutal. It's not just vicious. It's not just not even barbaric. It's just senselessly stupid to allow cost to be a barrier to care. Why would we do that with doctors when we don't with the fire department? If your house is on fire, nobody asks the fire department to check your bank balance before they put out the fire because we don't want the whole block to burn down. Well, infection in an age of pandemic is kind of like that. It's very directly analogous to that. And so the idea that we're forcing people to pay for their care and knowing that so many people can't, it is just, again, it's senseless, and we can do better than that.
Yeah, and even if we were to allow and encourage a more employer-based option and somehow encourage, avenues for jobs, we're seeing, 800,000 people a week now losing their jobs with the economic disparity from this. So like even that isn't really even that great of an option. But furthermore, I think the point you were making earlier when I mentioned the ACA was, it was written from corporate sponsors for their interests. And that, broadly speaking, I think it touches upon a lot of the issues that we just kind of displayed it being connected, being, economic disparities, corporate welfare, essentially, right? And corporate laws, and kind of what comes in that. And to take that a little bit further, so I was reading some of your articles, and I realized that you've been writing actively on activism issues for quite some time. And some of them I thought were really interesting at both exposing issues that were more in the zeitgeist then, but should still be now, and like other dimensions of the same problem. So for example, national security. And
I'm curious to see what you found. Yeah, I have been writing for a long time. Thanks for exploring it.
No, I was really refreshed. Like it got me more geeked to talk to you. So there's the article title is "Leaving Cards on the Counter-Terror Table:
Yes.
Ways to Better Wage War on the War on Terror."
No one ever talks about this piece, and I think it's among the more important things I've ever written, I think. And it's, thank you for finding
I was cheering you along, man. I'm going to directly quote you because it's I couldn't do it better myself. So you said, "It's not, quote, our freedoms that, quote, they hate, but rather our weapons and our longstanding penchant of giving them to regimes that deny freedoms and oppress their own people." You then go on to cite Alan Greenspan, then chairman of the Fed, in which he openly says that the Iraq, and he says this in 2003, that the war in Iraq was being motivated by oil stability. And then you go on to segue into talking about defense purchases of arms being a form of corporate welfare. So you wrote this in 2011, and defense spending is now a bipartisan agreement. And every major spending, or actually, how should I put this, continuing resolution, because we no longer have budgets that have been passed, hasn't changed. Has any of this changed? Has this corporate welfare in another means changed?
It has grown worse. That's the only way it's changed. This spring, Nancy Pelosi and the corporate Democratic Party that she leads signed off on our criminal president getting $750 billion for the Department of so-called Defense in 1 year alone. There's never in the history of our species been an allocation like that for anything, let alone weapons to a aspiring tyrant. And this is after the impeachment process. So how a congressional leader can initiate an impeachment process to try to hold accountable an aspiring tyrant, and then turn around and not only expand his surveillance powers, as they also did separately, but then to hand him a $740 billion check. And it's even worse than that might sound because, as you noted a few minutes ago, the pandemic is a national security issue. Can't fight that with the Defense Department. We have other national security issues. How about the climate catastrophe? It's burning the entire state of California. Houston just got hit with 2 hurricanes at once. There are inland hurricanes in Oklahoma, I believe it was, catastrophic flooding in the Southeast. You can't fight that with the Defense Department. Well, how about the continuity of the Republic and the need to ensure that an election happens? Well, that's the post office is the national security agency there that's most implicated. You can't fight that with the Army or the Navy or the Air Force, the Marines. So why are we spending $740 billion on a set of tools that can't possibly respond to any of our top 3 national security threats? We do have real threats. Medicare for All would respond to one of them. Saving the Post Office would respond to one of them. The Green New Deal would respond to one of them. The Defense Department can't respond to any of them. So why are all our tax dollars and our federal resources being sucked into the black hole of the military industrial complex, noting particularly that its creator warned us about it? This is another theme in my writing that comes up. It's just the preposterousness of an entire political culture just losing sight of its own history, and not like long distant history. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. It was 2 generations, and it was on television, national television, at the birth of the medium, and how an entire body of 535 members of Congress can go to work every day as if the creator of the military industrial complex didn't give them the warning in broad daylight, heard by millions of people. It's almost as if we've elected the most ignorant among us to do this work. You're reminding me of the Plato quote that you were paraphrasing a little while ago.
Yeah, and I have one response to your question. Why? Could it be that I can't buy shares of the Green New Deal like I can buy shares of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin?
Indeed. I think you nailed it. The irony, though, frankly, is that we can all buy shares in companies that could benefit from the Green New Deal. There are tremendous opportunities in the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal, frankly, would be an engine. So would Medicare for All. Both of them are economically generative policies. Medicare for All, because it would basically liberate any number of people to have more labor mobility, to pursue entrepreneurial choices, because one of their basic needs would be addressed instead of only available through the marketplace. It would also, at the same time, Medicare for All would relieve the leading expense item for most major companies. So it would enable a huge job creation boom. The Green New Deal, similarly, I mean, the vision's for a federal jobs guarantee. And ultimately, if we can, instead of spending money on missiles and weapons and profits for Raytheon, instead to spend that money on putting a generation to work that's seeking opportunities, and frankly, that we need work done. I think at the moment, one thing that comes to mind that even our criminal president has acknowledged is the opportunity in the context of our national forests on the West Coast to do different kinds of forest management techniques. And I'm particularly a fan of replicating indigenous forest management techniques. And that's going to take a ton of people. The market can't mobilize those resources. There's no profit motive in it, but the Green New Deal could. And how good is it going to be for our state when it doesn't burn down next year, right? I mean, the costs are incalculable. The costs of inaction and the current inertia are incalculable, and people pretend that we can't afford the Green New Deal. We can't afford not to embrace the Green New Deal.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I had Ron Good. He's the chairman of the North Fork Mono Tribe on the podcast. And he actually, I can give you some numbers here. He told me that only 5% of California meadows are healthy. And he also said that something around 80 to 90% of the forest is canopy, where pre-1840 it was 40%. And that's mostly because the tribes were heavily managing the land.
Right.
And he said it cost about $100,000 to fix every meadow. So I did a rough math. It's like 1.2 billion in order by his rough math to do that. Mm-hmm. And the amount of people that we need to employ, like to your point, would be a lot. And then the second order effects of having healthy forests, healthy wildlife, healthy ecosystems is huge. But I think the kind of the tenor of a lot of what you were saying, I think, is that the market is really good at doing something and finding some way of doing it, but it's not good at figuring out how much something that you can't calculate and also being told what to do, right? So like the market's not going to be able to calculate, like there's not going to be any way of being able to price in like, oh, if we do all these Green New Deal and we start all these companies, what innovation is going to come from that? Because it's going to have to come from that, right? We're going to have to find more efficient ways of doing just about everything.
Mm-hmm. And it'll be a huge engine of prosperity. All the engineering projects are going to
companies, to your point, of like getting into a startup at the right time at the ground level, or getting trained by a startup again at coming in, or being able to buy into a company. Like around 2008, there was a lot of solar companies that were going up, right? They would be like that again, but across pretty much everything that you touch, which would be wild. But it's hard to price that all in. So I feel like most people's knee-jerk reactions, especially in this kind of okay, so I'm gonna give an analogy, and it's gonna finish my thought. So hang with me.
Okay.
So David Foster Wallace is a great author, and he has this great speech called "This Is Water," and he starts the speech by saying this. I'm gonna swear in it differently though. So he goes, "There's two young fish swimming along when an older fish swims by and says, 'Morning, boys, how's the water?' And the two fish swim along a little bit further, and the one younger fish says to the other, 'The fuck is water?'" And the point of the story is to say, the most obvious things are the ones that usually go unnoticed, right? Like fish swimming in water. And I would say what I just said with the way that kind of capitalism has trouble pricing things in it can't see is that our thinking is a corporate mindset. And I think that it is such a hard way to even notice the things like saying like, but what's it going to cost, or what's it going to do? A lot of that you have to step out of that, and I think it's very obvious. And to go further on to some of your writing, you said something about farm subsidies that I thought was really interesting. How they're a source of geopolitical tension. And you said when U.S. grain is dumped on foreign markets at least less than the cost of local production, the ultimate effect is to drive small farmers in those countries out of the market, leaving their countries to be dependent on U.S. grain. And then it goes further to say agriculture indicates that 10% of the recipients, 10% of the recipients receive 66% of the payments, while 80% of the producers get just 16% of all the subsidies.
One of the challenges in terms of rationalizing, especially the agricultural subsidies, is the structural overrepresentation of rural states in the Senate. And so senators from particularly Midwestern sort of like, farm belt states have been an impediment to rationalization here. Now, one of the ironies is, and this is why that the closing statistic that you cited about the distribution of the subsidies is so important, because they're not subsidies to people. They're subsidies to corporations. They're yet another example of corporate welfare, not unlike the weapons contracts. And just like the weapons contracts, they engineer instability. And at the end of the day, I think a lot of people forget that we do, in fact, produce enough food to feed every human being on this planet. And we choose to feed a lot of it to animals. And, I don't meet an entirely plant-based diet. I certainly favor one. And, our agricultural system also could be better oriented to meet the needs of people instead of the profits of producers. Factory farms here are especially pernicious. So just to remix a couple parts of the stuff I didn't know about at the time I wrote that article, I discovered just this year that over the history of California, our state, especially the Central Valley, has had recurring catastrophic floods on the order of like every 150 years. And like severe floods that will inundate the entire Central Valley. And at the moment, because there's so many concentrated animal feeding operations across the Central Valley, if that happened, we would have something like a 1,000-mile lake of animal fecal matter floating in the Central Valley. And the risk to public health is profound. And even setting aside the flooding risk in California, when you have concentrated animal feeding operations, they're necessarily vectors for likely disease transmission from animals to people. The COVID virus came from a similar dynamic, that zoonotic disease transmission. And so, factory farms are predisposed to it. And even setting aside and I've heard other people wax more eloquent about this than me, but the just profound misery and suffering in, people look at this different ways, but especially among mammals, it's just absolutely gruesome. And, that's another area where our agricultural subsidies, frankly, are just ignorant. They ignore the reality. They ignore the impacts. And maybe they ignore the externalities. I want to step back and just circle around that word. You were describing all the ways in which the market can't internalize in the price equation the impacts of seemingly private transactions. Every time we have a fossil fuel producer contract with someone to deliver oil, they act as if only the producer and the buyer's interests are implicated. Except at the end of the day, we know that they're stealing from the future and that we're all going to have to pay the cost because they're spitting it into the atmosphere. But the future and the rest of us don't get to participate in that price equation. And that's one of the failures of the market, is by allowing these transactions that have profound public consequences without those consequences being factored into the supply demand equation. And, it's I don't want to say it's anybody's fault, but it's just led us to make some really stupid decisions. And I would like us to make some better decisions that will keep more people alive.
Yeah, I agree with that. I had no idea about that flood risk. I did know about the 158 floods. I didn't know about that much concentrated animal stock. That's quite alarming. So I'm from Illinois. I live in San Diego, but I'm from Illinois. And
I spent 10 years in Chicago in the 90s.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's where I'm from. That's dope. I actually have one of your speeches to the law school. I think it was a speech. It reads like a speech. Yeah, I have. I actually read that too, and I have some things out of it too. But anyways,
those are good pieces out of my body of work to draw out. Thanks for
they caught my eye. I know like pig farms there. They'll have like lakes of the fecal matter, right? And it's horrible smelling. You can smell them from quite some distance away.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not like, to your point, you touched upon, you're not allowed to actually, because of agriculture gag laws, you're actually not allowed to take videos and really even talk
Right.
about the horrors of them, which I think is uh, really an awful thing in and of itself. But I think this kind of corporate mindset of so much going to so little, like 10% get 66% of all of it, that's crazy. And so the derecho, the inland hurricane, was in Iowa, right?
Yeah.
And Iowa, like that gets a lot of corn subsidies and the like. But I never had thought that a lot of those subsidies and a lot of the subsidies that were coming from, the loss of crop yields and things like that are going to like a smaller and smaller subset. Like I know the death of the family farm is something that has been coming on, but after reading that and then further researching, I didn't realize how far it had kind of gone off the cliff already.
Oh yeah, corporate consolidation across the Midwest and the South has really it's part of why we're in this mess, because the very same Republican senators who represent those states aren't answering to family farmers. They're answering to corporate agribusiness. And corporate agribusiness, just like the corporate weapons manufacturers or the corporate health insurance companies, they have their own industrial interests. And ultimately, that's why we see policies come out of Congress that reflect government not for of and by the people, but government for of and by capital.
Right, right. Which leads into, finance reform. I mean, election reform, like that needs to definitely happen. Just like a sidebar of like, I read a fair amount of your work coming into this, mostly because I was finding it so enjoyable, to be perfectly honest. I wouldn't have read so thoroughly if I wasn't enjoying what I was reading. But I had this thought multiple times, and my wife asked me, like how it was going. And the thought that came to mind, and I wanted to make sure I said it before I forgot, which is, I now understand why Speaker Pelosi will not debate you.
She would certainly be embarrassed. I mean, I appreciate that. And I don't want to brag, and it's not any genius of mine. It's just, I know the truth too well. And it hasn't been reported. Reporters have been giving her softball questions for 20 years. She hasn't debated anyone since Ronald Reagan was the president, which is just absurd to me. And that's how she gets away with her voting record that nobody knows about. The district sends her back to Congress every 2 years. In spite of her active support for conservative interests, Republicans construct an image of her as if she's some lion of the left, which frankly serves conservative interests. And the gross part is that so many Democrats fall for the ruse. And you're absolutely right. I think the reason she can't debate me without losing, without her career ending, is that her record can't withstand scrutiny. And one of for me, the points of greatest disappointment in this process is just how absolutely complicit the press has been. In a democracy with a robust free press, if incumbents don't debate, the press calls them out. Or someone asks them hard questions. Why don't you debate your opponent? What are you trying to hide? The district's interested in why you call the Green New Deal, the Green New Deal, the Green New Dream, or whatever. The district's interested in why you don't bring Medicare for all to the House floor for the vote. The district's interested in why you're extending the tyrant's surveillance powers or giving him world historically unprecedented military budgets. But nobody asks her those questions. And on the rare occasion that she gets a question that demonstrates any independence at all, like Wolf Blitzer on CNN the other day, she basically melts down and has a tirade, not unlike the way our criminal president responds to interlocutors. And, I just feel like we deserve certainly better than that. People should answer questions from the press, and the press should ask hard questions. When the press isn't asking hard questions, it should unnerve us all, because frankly, that is as much a threat to elections and their legitimacy as computers being hacked, or foreign state intelligence actors leaning on the scale and buying ads, or Republican thugs intimidating voters. When the press doesn't show up for work, it does beg the question as to whether or not we can safely describe our elections as free or fair. And in spite of that, I'm certainly running the strongest campaign that we can without a press engaged to do the work that the Fourth Estate is supposed to, and doing everything we can to inform and educate voters that we have an alternative for the first time in 30 years to send a new voice to Congress.
Yeah. I think I found my theme. So I think that in it's definitely not fair. I don't think we have, like, as far as do we have free and fair elections, we certainly don't have fair elections. I mean, we have the amount of corporate influence. There's no way that we do. And which is going to lead me to the next point. So do we have free elections? I think in some places we do, in America, but I mean, in other places, probably not, because of how much they're really actively trying to make it difficult for people to vote, especially in certain areas. And obviously it's of certain demographics. Which you actually talk about Section 5 in the voting rights and something else that I read of yours, which we'll get to that in a minute. But the corporate consolidation of everything is really what has been the past 20 years, I would say. Like, it definitely was happening more, but I would say it ramped up since 2001 and kind of the shift in the New World Order and all of that. And as far as like the fourth estate, like, it is definitely complicit, and it's definitely been taken over and consolidated in all the same ways we were talking about, agriculture and national security, or, you name it. Like, I'm a big fan of Noam Chomsky, and, his talking about how the media, how they use flack and access and all of this to really buy access and by ability to talk about what they do talk about, don't talk about. Like, they're definitely
manufacture consent. I think that's his term, isn't it?
Manufacturing consent. Yes,
I think that's right. I think of him as the progenitor of that idea, and I hear you describing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's him. Yeah, definitely. And he also said, in America, there's only one party, the corporate party, of which we have two factions: the Democrats and the Republicans.
Yep.
And I don't think a truer thing could be said. And I definitely see it in your race. But it also in all of the issues that you've been writing about and we're talking about so far.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been alarmed by that. It hasn't always been the case, right? I mean, until, say, the early 90s, there was a Labor Party in the United States. And its identity shifted. Since 68, it had been the Democrats. But, starting in the 90s, under the administration of Bill Clinton, the Democrats perceived an opportunity in moving to the right to compete for corporate fundraising. And that was a tactical victory, but a grand strategic loss, because it left entire regions, entire zones of the electoral landscape just entirely unrepresented. It's one reason that so many Americans don't vote today, because there's just no one running to represent them. It's one reason we have bipartisan consensus on so many stupid policies, because there's nobody in Congress to advocate on behalf of we the people of the United States, because they're all sent there by their corporate donors to pursue their interests instead of their constituents. This pattern of Democrats fueling the rise of conservatism because they perceive whether it's themselves as weak on national security, so they have to outflank the Republicans and be even more ooh-rah. So on the rare occasion, maybe the one thing that this criminal president has done that I could support was to try to pull back the U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. And it's the one time that Democrats actually showed up to make their otherwise rhetorical resistance real. And they kept us in a war that we've been in for 20 years. And how Democrats get away with outflanking Trump on the right, it's just absurd to me. And then they still have the audacity to run to their donors and say, give us money because there's this aspiring fascist in Washington. And yes, he is an aspiring fascist, but the Democrats pave his path entirely. And not just, I don't even mean that like in the abstract. I mean, even directly, there's news reports suggest that we were just talking about Bill Clinton's administration moving the party to the right. It was Bill Clinton who encouraged Donald Trump to run for the presidency. And the Clinton campaign was suggesting that media outlets cover him because they thought that was going to be a good idea. It was going to help them. And we saw how well that turned out. Our supposed leaders, particularly in the Democratic Party, have proven time and time again that, frankly, they have no idea what they're doing. People pretend that Nancy Pelosi is playing four-dimensional chess. She's basically playing like one-dimensional checkers, and she's getting outflanked at every opportunity. And that's charitable because it presumes that she is at least trying to mount resistance that she's failing to produce. There's a whole other analysis that would suggest that she's more motivated by her class interests than her partisan ones, which would suggest that she's not playing on the same team as the rest of us at all. And that also would unfortunately fit too many facts, from choosing to fund Donald Trump's concentration camps to the military budget we were talking about, the PAYGO rules, welcoming Juan Guaido to Washington, punching down at the squad. I could go on. Her record reveals effectively the voice of a centrist Republican leading the Democratic Party. And that is a profound disservice, not just to the values of the party and the needs of our communities, but I dare say democracy writ large.
Yeah, without doubt. Yeah, Bill Clinton made a tactical decision to go to the right on corporate interests and to make the law and order play, and also to reform welfare. Like that was his thing, right? And that's how he, got the White House, and coming from Arkansas, and that was really their play, and it worked very well for them. And and some of your critiques of Obama too, which I thought were excellent. The Economist calls him the great moderate, and I think that that's a way better analogy of him, right? Like he's down the line in the middle on pretty much everything, if not a little right. And by today's standards, he's definitely a little right.
Oh yeah.
And the thing that frustrates me so much about the Democratic Party, and I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican. I refuse to have any stance on any of that. Is the fact that here's the thing. I think they are playing four-dimensional chess, and they're playing four-dimensional chess while you said earlier
against us, against we the people.
And then right. you said earlier that they're either ignorant, we're electing people who are ignorant, and I would say that the world is a stage and they've chosen their character. And yep. I think that that's really what they're doing. And maybe they are playing four-dimensional chess, but they're doing it to serve their own interests. And I'll find the article and I'll post it when I post this episode, but there was a study that was done, and I was reading it around 2016 about how politicians are more closely related ideologically to their donors than they are to their constituents. Mm-hmm. So just follow the money, right?
Absolutely. And it's very revealing. It's one reason with Pelosi that I feel such a urgent need to win a new voice for our city, because she doesn't answer to local voters or our values. When it was Bush in office and so many of us were in the streets marching and shutting down the city to try to stop the war, she was taking impeachment off the table, funding his wars, insulating his CIA from accountability for torture. When it was Barack Obama cracking down on the press and accelerating deportations, she wasn't fighting for our community's interests then. And under Trump, as he's denigrating people from Latin American countries in horrible terms and deriding immigrants in all the various places we came from, she settles for words, while at every point that she actually has institutional authority, resigning it or using it in some way to actively enable him. And that is exactly, one way in which this has happened that she hasn't frankly taken any or borne any accountability for is the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to serve on the Supreme Court. Speaker Pelosi could have blocked the Senate from considering the nomination at all if she either impeached the president, as she should have done for any number of reasons last year and other reasons that have emerged since, like lying to the public or inciting violence or human rights abuses or putting public health at risk or enriching himself at public expense. None of that was in the charade that she pursued a year ago. So she could have proceeded with any of those articles of impeachment, which are long overdue, entirely legitimate, frankly crucial to at least seek the vindication of, if not to invite the same criminality from future presidents. And it would have kept the nomination hearings from proceeding. But the only person in the country who could have stopped them, Nancy Pelosi, chose not to. And that's another area where just the press, I feel like, has failed so miserably, because that's a story. Someone should report on that. I
never thought of that. That's a really good point. I've had this thought multiple times when it comes to issues on the Supreme Court too, where it's like, oh, okay, that they overruled that. You can write another law, right? Or like you can keep pushing things, right? Like, that, right? They just told you where the holes were in that.
It depends, frankly. It's true if it's a matter of statutory interpretation, but the court also rules on constitutional questions. And those you can't simply legislate around. That does require amendments, which are a higher procedural threshold. But yes,
right.
Plenty of ways to thoughtfully.
More in the interpretation of it, but yes, okay, yeah. That's a very good distinction. Leave it to the lawyer to correct that. Thank you. But that's a really good point about the Supreme Court nominee, because quite frankly, like I worry about Trump. I'm not going to say I don't worry about Trump, but I worry more about what comes after Trump, right? And what we're allowing and the cultural norms that we're letting erode. And when it comes to her nomination, politically, she's perfect politically, right? But as far as like record and fitness, let alone timing, there's a lot of questions that should be begged, and quite frankly, the pressure that nobody is putting on Speaker Pelosi to do exactly what you just said, which I hadn't even thought of, is brilliant. Like that should be what we were doing.
The Democrats circulated a memo across the party 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago. The Intercept covered it, and impeachment was one of at least, I think it was 10 different ways that the nomination hearings could have been delayed. And the reason it didn't proceed is that the only person who can effectuate that particular strategy is the Speaker of the House. And at every point that an executive has required accountability, she has frankly resigned the opportunity to pursue it. Even when she impeached Donald Trump, she limited the process to the weakest charge. And that's just part, again, of the question is the Speaker ineffective, or is the Speaker entirely too effective at pursuing her class interests rather than her partisan ones?
Right. And how much courage do they have? Because, I can tell from talking to you and even just getting your hat in this ring, that required a lot of courage, right? And I think that our lawmakers and our states, our people that are representing us, right, that have ability to make laws that can increase our livelihood, change our livelihood, completely change our way of life, because that is what Congress has the power to do, should be those that are courageous and virtuous. And it doesn't seem like her record goes up to that whatsoever. And in this instance alone, let alone the 30 years of examples. So as we're on this thought of rhetoric, words, and their hollowness, I want to ask you a question about the Patriot Act.
Yeah.
So
one of my favorite pieces of legislation.
I actually had this. I said this on the first episode, our first interview of this series, and it was. It's not that I enjoy studying the Patriot Act. It's also like I don't enjoy flossing, but I think it's necessary. So, okay, you said something about it that I once again, a lawyer could probably be the only one that finds something like this, and I hadn't. It's a hole in my looking over the Patriot Act, and I'm going to quote you: "If the government finds that you're talking with the wrong people, you have no right to defend that you never intended to support violence or that no violence occurred or was encouraged." So the gross First Amendment problems with the Patriot Act, I had no idea about. And then you go on to talk about Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, in which the Humanitarian Law Project was working with the Kurdish Workers' Party, which the Kurdish Workers' Party at the time were dubbed a terrorist organization or a pseudo-terrorist organization, something along those lines. They had probably done violent acts, but what the Humanitarian Law Project was trying to do was get them to speak and talk about issues as opposed to be violent about them. And that then got them in this clause of the Patriot Act. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, and then if you can expand on if things like that have been changed or just gotten worse.
Right. Well, you're talking about there are prosecutions for material support of terrorism. And material support in the context of the Humanitarian Law Project was found to adhere when a nonprofit was trying to encourage conflict resolution, to de-escalate conflict, because the participants in the workshops included militants, according to the US government. That's facilitating terrorism. And that's another example of just idiotic policy. What sense does it make to criminalize efforts to de-escalate conflict? But we should be encouraging efforts to de-escalate conflict, not criminalizing them. But we're so interested, or the national security agencies are so interested in the appearance of effectiveness, that they're more interested just in winning convictions, whether or not those convictions in any way advance national security. There is another case in the same vein, another material support for a prosecution case this was in the First Circuit, Boston, and the defendant's name was Tariq Mehana, Mehana, I think. And he was an academic who was translating materials for public discussion, and that was decided to be material support for terrorism. So if you can't encourage conflict de-resolution and you can't translate texts without being held liable by the government for facilitating terrorism, it just begs the question, what are we supposed to do about these issues? And it seems that the government's policy is all we are allowed to do is fight. We can't talk, we can't translate, we can't try to de-escalate. And the idea that the de-escalating or talking or translating is classified as if it was facilitating terrorism, I think is a reflection not just of idiocy, but frankly corruption, because that insulates the system from the kind of accountability that we all frankly need it to have.
Yeah. I had that translation case. That's crazy. That is a flat violation of First Amendment rights and
That was exactly the
criminalizing.
argument. It was a First Amendment defense, and the courts, basically overruled it. It was the Humanitarian Law Project was the sort of high watermark or low watermark of these cases at the time. The Mahana case came after I wrote that article, so that's why I raised it, because it got even worse than it was at the time that I wrote that piece.
Wow, that is unfortunate to hear. And then if you kind of like, if you team that thought with the rulings or the policy of drone strikes, and how essentially if you're a military age male, regardless, and you're hanging out with other military age males in some perceived area of geolocation that says this is of a terrorist holding, drone strikes are all good.
That's exactly how a 16-year-old U.S. citizen born in the U.S. was killed by a drone strike, because his father was somebody in which the U.S. government had an interest. And this was, I mean, the case of Anwar al-Awlaki and his son are so revealing, because this was a father and son pair, U.S. citizens. They were seeking vindication in the U.S. courts of their right to trial at the time that they were, obliterated by a flying robotic assassin robot halfway around the world from where its pilot was. And the idea, and just to be clear, the thing that he was killed for were words. Now, they were insightful words, like words that incited violence. And so maybe there's an issue there that's certainly legitimate for a court to discern. But to just assassinate people based on their words does fly in the direct face of a little thing called the Constitution that we adopted when we created the Republic. And the idea that we're killing people based on their parents' words, like, we're into some other zone there, and that's not in any way defensible in any system of law. And that's national policy.
And it was the first thing they said. The first thing they wrote down was that's got everybody to be able to talk, speak to whoever you want, speak whatever you want. That was the first law enshrined, right? The First Amendment. It's so frustrating to hear that, honestly. Thoughts are escaping me right now. I didn't realize the details quite of that case, and that's outrageous, and it's really egregious. But thank you for writing all that you have written, and for running and getting into the fray. Like, this has obviously been, I would imagine, very hard and a very difficult journey going up against somebody of the megalith themselves.
It is intense, yeah.
So thank you for all of your work. I know that we're right up at time. Thank you for squeezing me into your schedule. Maybe we can wrap in 1 second. Is there anything else before I just kind of stop and we can talk for one more second that you wanted to say before we shut it off?
I appreciate you asking. Maybe I just invite your listeners to check out our campaign website at shahidforchange.us, and would especially encourage people to sign up to volunteer. If you like what you heard and you want to put gas in our tank, donate. And I certainly would invite votes from anybody in the 12th Congressional District of California. I'm looking forward to representing our city in Washington.
Awesome. Well, we're all rooting for you. Thank you very much.
Right on. Good to connect with you, John. Thanks for the interview.